So my presentation tonight is part travelogue, part historical narrative, and part psychological study. Because, we have to understand why these people did what they did, and how did the Indians react to what was going on around them. All this is part of that grand story. When you read a general history of San Francisco, you read about, the Spanish came up and they founded a mission, they founded Presidio. Well, think about it. They had to travel over 1,000 miles to get here from Mexico. And that's a major journey. All the stuff that they had to go through, and that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. It would be like somebody asking you to walk to St. Louis from here, 2,000 miles from here. And you don't know where the roads are. You don't know where all the food sources are because there's lots of stretches without a McDonald's. You don't know what the natives are like. Now, I heard Midwesterners are friendly, but you just never know. But imagine, I'm being a little facetious, but imagine though you had that challenge of going to a strange land. You don't know what's ahead of you, but you know you're going to do it. And they were successful because, for two reasons. One is because of the kindness and the generosity of the Indians. And second of all, because they had good leaders, really good leaders. And you'll find out about them as I talk more. So first, let's talk about the people who are already here. So before colonization, California had the highest population of indigenous people in North America. Estimates range from 300,000 to 800,000 people. Before contact, there were almost 200 tribes in California. Among the tribes living around the bay were the Miwok and Patwin of the North Bay, the Yokuts of the Delta, the Chochenyo and Muecma Ohlone of the East Bay, and the Ramaytush Ohlone on the peninsula, and the Rumsen Ohlone to the south. Ohlone is sort of a general term like European, but each tribe was separate and distinct. So the Chochenyo Ohlone had a similar language to on the East Bay, a similar language to the Ramaytush of the peninsula, but it was kind of like Spanish and Portuguese. They had a basic root, but it was a different language. And this is what the Spanish marveled about, that you could walk 20 miles and come to a tribe that's speaking a different language altogether. Anyway, these people, of course, had been here for thousands upon thousands of years. They lived in complete harmony with nature, and they were basically a happy, healthy people. So what was the motivation of coming into Alta, California? It really started with this man. And I'm sorry I misspelled his name. It should be Jose de Galvez. He was an experienced and competent bureaucrat from Spain, and he was sent as Visitador to New Spain. Visitador is kind of like an inspector general. He came to clean up the finances and the administration that was going on in New Spain because it wasn't being profitable, it wasn't being productive, and a lot of corruption. So he was sent to straighten things out. And one of the first things he did was to expel the Jesuits, because the Jesuits, according to the king and his advisors, were just making too much money and being too powerful. Because the Jesuits were running these haciendas where they were producing a lot of food and making a lot of money. And the king didn't like that. So they expelled the Jesuits and brought in the Franciscans. Now, while Galvez was in Spain, he heard about the Russian colony in Sitka and how the Russian seal and otter hunters had extended their search for these animals down along the coast of California. He also heard rumors from the Spanish ambassador that the Tsarina, Queen Catherine, had plans to expand Russian settlements into California. Now think about that for a minute. Think about the vagaries of history. What if the Russians had actually gone through and colonized California? Would we be speaking Russian now? Or would there have been a war between Russia and the United States over California? That could have happened. Didn't. Anyway, Galvez also suggested to the King Carlos that the British and Dutch explorers might also try to claim the area. So the king told Galvez to send an expedition into Alta California to find and settle the bays of San Diego and Monterey and extend Spanish claims to the north. The man Galvez chose to lead the expedition was Gaspar de Portolá, age 53, a captain in the Spanish army. Now keep in mind that 53 is getting to be an old person back in those days. So he had already been a soldier in Portugal and Italy, and now he's being given this commission to walk 1,000 miles up into Alta California. But he was a dutiful and experienced leader and quickly began to recruit soldiers in Loreto for the trip. Some of these men had been jailed for various crimes, but were given a choice by Galvez. You can either stay in prison or join Portola on a long hike. So a lot of them chose to go on a hike. While Portola traveled north by land from Mexico, 2 supply ships sailed up the coast from Baja California. You can see where the land and sea parties met here on July 1st, 1769, on the beach in San Diego, where the San Diego River empties into the bay. Today it's called Spanish Landing Park, right near the airport on Harbor Island. There's a little monument there to let you know that that's what happened. There was an Indian village on what is now Old Town, and when the ships arrived in San Diego Bay, most of the sailors and soldiers aboard were dying of scurvy. By the time Portola arrived with his land party, only 16 of the 90 Spanish sailors and soldiers were alive. Portola's first task was to nurse these men back to health. The Padres set up a cross and were soon met by members of the Kumeya'i tribe. They were friendly, but Father Crespi, who became the main diarist of the expedition, wrote that the Indians were hard bargainers when trading their muscles for beads. Eventually, Father Serra built a mission further up the San Diego River. The original adobe building of Mission San Diego de Alcalá was finished in 1813, but like all the missions but one, it fell into disrepair after the Mexican government secularized them. The present-day mission church was completed in 1931 and is today a parish church. This was the first of 21 missions the Spanish were to build from San Diego in the south to Sonoma in the north. When California became a state, many missions were overrun or abandoned or sold. Abraham Lincoln returned the missions to the Catholic Church in 1862. They all remain parish churches except for Sonoma and La Purísima missions, which are state parks. Portola set out with 74 people, 4 officers, 27 soldados de cuerda, 7 Catalan volunteer soldiers, Sergeant Ortega as the lead scout, Miguel Costanzo as the engineer and also journalist, 2 priests, 7 muleteers, 16 Christian Indians. The jackets the soldiers wore had 7 layers of deerskin to protect them from arrows. The shield was made from several layers of bull hide. They carried a lance and a pistol called a trabuco. The leather chaps were to protect their legs when going through thickets. "50 burros were used because they are docile, and each burro could carry about 200 pounds. The expedition had over 100 packs of provisions for a 6-month journey. Besides food, they carried tools, tents, extra clothing, and blankets. One burro carried a pack just of beads and trinkets to trade with the native people. Some donkeys may have been used, but only a few because donkeys can be ornery. As they arrived in the valleys around what is now Oceanside, Crespi marveled at the fields of flower as if they had been planted. He also remarked that there were many fields that had been burned, and later learned the Indians used burns to keep down the brush and to promote new growth of grasses whose seeds they harvested. Isn't that a lovely picture? Initially, the Luiseño people of this area told the Spanish to go away, but 29 years later, Mission San Luis Rey was built. It became known as the King of the Missions because of its extensive lands, 900,000 square acres, with huge fields of crops and cattle. At its high point, 5,000 Luiseño people lived at the mission. The Luiseño people continue to live in the area, and they host a powwow every year, welcoming other tribes to join them in what's called fancy dancing. Despite what missionalization did to their culture, a number of mission tribes still come to the mission of their area for social events because it is a focal point of their history, and it is where their ancestors lived and are buried. This is the trail and Trabuco Canyon in the foothills of the Santa Ana Mountains in eastern Orange County. This is one of the places you can actually follow in the footsteps of the expedition. It was here that one of the soldiers lost his trabuco, remember the pistol? Hence the name given to it by Father Crespi. As they proceeded north, they came to a village in the area, the Santa Ana Mountains still to the north, of 200 villagers of the Octojaman people. Crespi wrote that they mingled with us with as much familiarity as they could have done with their own countrymen. Time and time again, with few exceptions, the native people welcomed the Spanish with gifts of food and shell necklaces. Crespi was hoping these friendly people would kiss the Christian images he showed them, but they declined. Nevertheless, he decided the area would be good for a mission. As they crossed the Santa Ana Mountains, they came to the Santa Ana River, which Crespi described as a good-sized river going through the midst of a plain. Here they experienced the first of a number of earthquakes, and Crespi called the spot Dulcísimo Nombre de Jesús del Río de los Temblores, which is sweet Jesus, the river of the earthquakes. This is the longest coastal river in Southern California, running from the San Bernardino Mountains to the Pacific Ocean, emptying at Huntington Beach. 80 years later, German immigrants would settle here and call it Anaheim. The expedition camped alongside this river just 3 miles southeast from present-day Disneyland. They proceeded west through the Grand Central San Gabriel Valley, which at that time was full of oak trees, grasslands, creeks, and willow trees, and many villages of the Tongva people. So this became one of the most productive areas in the United States, where they grew all sorts of things, but especially orange trees. And the first orange trees were planted in 1870, and by the 1940s, there were 67,000 acres of orange groves. Now, to see an orange grove, you have to go to Citrus Ranch Park in Tustin. Everything else is houses now. The expedition was met by the Tongva people who lived throughout the Los Angeles basin. These Tongva men are wearing ceremonial headdresses made of feathers and quills. When the Spanish arrived, they came first. They were a little fearful, but then they came out of curiosity. And eventually the chief offered them baskets of sage and shell beads. Sage is a very well-known herb used by the native people for cleansing and other purposes, but that was so it was a special gift they were giving to the Spanish. One of the many staples of many California tribes was the chia plant. The chia seeds are very nutritious and have 3 times more fat than acorns, plus a fair amount of protein. The women would grind them and add water to make a pudding. This was often served to the Spanish in their travels. I just want to mention, if you would like to try an actual Ohlone meal, I would invite you to go see the Ohlone Cafe in Berkeley. It's on the campus of UC Berkeley. It's run by two Ohlone men, and they started this restaurant because they wanted to show people how their people ate for centuries. So you can get a meal, for example, of baked trout and a chia seed pudding and a salad full of nuts and seeds and berries with a wild strawberry dressing and mushroom cakes and acorn bread. It's fabulous. So, and also I like the fact that we're supporting a revival of Indian culture. So I highly recommend you check out the Ohlone Cafe. You can see them online. And they also give a little talk about their people at the beginning of the meal, which is really touching. The expedition marveled at the finely woven baskets of the tribes they met along the way. They also noted that the natives' use of acorns and tried eating them themselves, but became sick, not knowing that they have to be leached first to get rid of the tannin, which is poisonous. So the native people, this was a staple of most California tribes, and they would take the acorn, they'd crack open, take out the nut, they'd pound the nut into powder, and then they would line a hole with leaves and put the powder in and pour water continually over the powder, then let it dry, and then they would put it into the basket to cook to make acorn soup. Now you might think, well, wait a minute, how do you cook in a basket? Well, these baskets were so tightly woven you could put water in them, and then to cook, you take a hot stone, put it into the acorn soup, and move it around with a stick so it doesn't burn the basket. And within a minute, the water's boiling, and then you have a special stick to take out the stone. So this is how they would survive during the wintertime, because they would store these nuts from the fall all the way through to the spring. This type of dwelling the Spanish saw throughout their travels and was common throughout Central California and the Bay Area. The framework is made from willow branches, which are easily bent. Then tule rushes are layered from bottom up with a hole at the top to let out the smoke. They are watertight and very cozy. When spring comes, the old ones are burnt to get rid of any pests, and new ones are built. This display is at the San Gabriel mission, but many missions have them on display in some fashion. The San Gabriel mission was known for its grain and wine production. It was founded in 1771, and the church completed in 1806. Father Crespi thought the area would be good for a pueblo, and in fact, in 1781, immigrants from Mexico stayed here to rest, then headed west to found La Ciudad de Nuestra Señora Reina de los Ángeles de Rio Porciúncula, which is the city of Our Lady, Queen of Angels of near the Los Angeles River, or they call it Porciúncula. The mission bells you see along the El Camino and Highway 101 were first put up by the California Federation of Women's Clubs in 1902. They were spaced 1 to 2 miles apart, the whole 400 miles length of the El Camino. Then the state took over the responsibility to maintain them. By 2005, Caltrans had restored 555 bells from San Diego to Sonoma. And of course, these are the ones you can see on the El Camino right here on the peninsula. As the expedition moved westward, they came to a place that had good water and plentiful trees, so they camped on a small hill overlooking the river. The hill is today's Elysian Park, and there is the Los Angeles River. This is not far from Dodger Stadium. So it's a little hard to imagine, what it looked like back then. You'd have to take away all that structure, but there is that little section of park where they camped out. And they actually have a little monument to show that's where they actually camped. I'm probably going to mention this later, but I do want to say that this whole trail was walked. A modern author, Nick Neely, decided to walk Portola's trail. So he walked from San Diego to San Francisco, and all along the way, he matched what Father Crespi said, what he wrote about in that particular location, and what it looks like now. And it's so interesting to see all the changes that took place. But as I told you, there are many places along that trail where you can walk and it still looks like when Portola was there. So I brought a couple of his books to sell if anybody wants to buy them, because I found that very useful in my presentation. It's a wonderful travelogue. As they walked in the area, they began to notice bubbles of tar boiling up from below and thought perhaps there was volcanoes in the area. They noted that a lot of ships could be pitched with all the tar they were seeing. Of course, that's what they would have thought about, because that's how you caulked the ship in those days, or you covered the caulking with tar, pitch. So that would have been really good for Spanish ships. So around the area of present-day Ventura, the expedition met the Chumash people. The Spanish were amazed that these were seagoing people who would paddle into the open ocean to hunt for seals or even small whales. They used redwood logs that had been washed up on the beach and split them into planks using stone wedges. The planks were smoothed with shark skin, then stitched together with yucca or milkweed fibers. The tar mixed with tree sap was used to make the canoe watertight. The Spanish called the place carpinteria, or carpenter's shop. Because they had the bounty of the sea and the resources of the land, they were described as being strong and healthy and very friendly. In fact, one whole village came to the expedition's camp and spent the whole day dancing and singing into the night. Finally, the officers had to give lots of beads and ask them to go away so they could sleep. The villages were large, and family groups would live in large tule homes. Father Crespi wrote that men were naked just like Adam before he sinned. And the women wore grass and deerskin skirts. Costanzo wrote that only the chiefs were allowed to have 2 wives. And in all the towns, they noticed a class of men who lived like women, associated with them, wore the same dress, adorned themselves with beads and earrings, and enjoyed great consideration among all the people. I should just mention that homosexuality was not a problem for most North American tribes. They just consider that part of nature. The Chumash are enjoying a revival of their culture and have days of coming together where they celebrate the past. Here, young men paddle out to the Channel Islands in a traditional canoe made in the old ways. So again, imagine, and they made it as our ancestors would have. So you first of all have to get a redwood log and then split it using these wedges and big stones to pound down the wedges to split it. And you have to keep splitting it until you get a plank. And then you have to sand it down. I mean, this canoe probably took at least 2 years to build. And then they sew the planks. This is what gets me. So they have to drill the holes with a hand drill, and then you sew it with the fibers, and then you use the tar to make it waterproof. And then they would decorate it. A lot of the ancient ships, ancient canoes would have abalone shells decorating along the side. Here's another path that the expedition walked on that you can hike on as well, just south of Morro Bay. It's naturally called the Portolá Trail. And if you were to walk past that ridge on the right, top right, you would come to Morro Rock. The expedition camped near Oso Flaco Lake. It's named that because Oso Flaco means a skinny bear. It's named that because the scouts killed a very skinny bear near here and ate it. They didn't realize that it was lean because it was sick, probably from being poisoned. The Indians would sometimes leave out poisoned meat to keep the bear population down. A number of the soldiers got sick, but no one died. Of course, they didn't learn this till much later. The expedition encountered grizzly bears along the way. Grizzlies were common throughout central northern California, and the town of Los Osos near San Luis Obispo got its name from all the bears in the area. They encountered a lot of bears as they came up to the Bay Area, too. The expedition was impressed by Morro Rock, which you now know as the weathered remains of the inside of an ancient volcano. They are even more impressed by the number of sea otters and seals in the area, something which you can still see today. As I understand it, the sea otter population is holding steady. They've had a lot of problems, but right now, around Monterey Bay especially, they seem to be doing okay. And if you want to go to Morro Bay, you can actually go out in a kayak. You have to keep your distance, but you can see them fairly close. And it's really charming to see how the mothers will keep the baby on the chest as they're floating on their back. As they moved north past what is now San Luis Obispo, they came to steep cliffs those are the cliffs of Big Sur, and they realized that they have to go inland. Of course, there was no bridge there at the time. This proved to be a daunting task. They would have to go over the formidable Santa Lucia mountain range. This would take them 2 weeks. And remember, they had all these pack animals that they have to bring up the hillsides too. And sometimes there was an Indian trail, sometimes there wasn't. So it was a very difficult task to get over these mountains. When they came out of the mountains, they saw a large bay ringed with sand dunes with the river running into it. This is exactly how Vizcaíno described Monterey Bay in 1602. And Portolá had the rough map that Vizcaíno had made. But for some reason, Portolá did not recognize it. Years later, he told a friend they must have been hallucinating for not seeing the bay right in front of them. Anyway, after holding a conference with the officers, they decided to keep moving north. They camped near Pinto Lake, which is near Watsonville, and the next day, they encountered one of these trees. The Spanish marveled at the height and the girth and the straightness of these trees. In Spanish, they named it Arbol de Madera Roja, which of course we called redwood trees, but it sounds so much nicer in Spanish. By the time they got to the area of San Gregorio Creek in San Mateo County, they were beginning to have their doubts about where they were. According to the latitude, they should have seen Monterey by now. Finally, when they arrived at the western peak of Montara Ridge above Pedro Point in Pacifica, they saw what they knew was San Francisco Bay. This was the name given by the earlier Spanish sailors to this large expanse from Point Reyes all the way to Pedro Point. So that whole area was known as San Francisco Bay. But now they knew they had gone too far, because to the west they saw the Farallones, which was, they knew what the latitude of the Farallones was. It was a well-known landmark. So they were clearly north of Monterey. They camped somewhere near San Pedro Creek, near today's Lindamar Beach in Pacifica. And they were very hungry. If they had just come later, much later, they could have eaten at the Taco Bell on the beach. But now they had to figure out how to get some food. So Portolá sent Sergeant Ortega to scout the area to the north and sent other scouts up the ridge to the east to look for deer. The scouting party looking for deer came to the top of a ridge and for the first time saw San Francisco Bay. They came back and excitedly reported this to Portolá, who followed them up the ridge. This happened on November 4th, 1769. Father Crespi excitedly wrote that all the navies in the world could fit into this magnificent bay. Sergeant Ortega returned and reported that he too had seen the bay and the strait where the ocean enters the bay. But Portolá was disappointed since he had missed Monterey Bay. That was his assignment after all. So he led the expedition all the way back along the same route, came to Monterey Bay, and again missed it. So finally he arrived in San Diego, where he found the mission in bad shape and traveled to Mexico for supplies. Now there's another casual statement. He goes all the way back to San Diego, and then he has to go all the way down to Mexico to get supplies, and then come all the way back to San Diego. And by the way, when he's down in Mexico, he's told, well, can you try again? So now he has to go all the way back to find Monterey Bay, which he finally did in 1770. And that's when the Presidio and Mission Carmel were founded. Now, this is much later. So originally, the Presidio, like a lot of those original missions and Presidios, were brush huts, and eventually they became more stone huts, and then it became regular adobe buildings. So it took a long time to actually come to this point where it looks like now. And in 1777, Monterey became the capital of Alta, California. So the news of a large inland bay to the north of Monterey inspired the viceroy, Bucareli, to make plans to settle the area as a buffer to the Russians. It so happened that another experienced soldier, Captain Juan Bautista de Anza, volunteered in 1774 to first search for a good inland route to Monterey. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given the task to find that route. Anza had the good fortune to meet a Sonoran Indian named Sebastian Tarabel. He had been sent to Mission San Gabriel but had escaped and made a long trek across the Sonoran Desert to reach Sonora. He was persuaded to join the exploratory expedition of 34 soldiers, priests, and muleteers to plot the route to San Gabriel Mission. Tarabel was able to show the Spanish where the water holes were, what places to avoid, and the easiest passes through the hills. After traveling two and a half months, over 700 miles, the group arrived at the San Gabriel Mission. An overland route had been found. And I'll just say this now, that whole route has become a National Historic Trail. And it is a big deal. So it's promoted by the National Park Service, and all along this trail, in every community, there's some sort of a wayside or a museum to talk about the expedition going through that particular area. And I wasn't able to bring brochures tonight. I didn't have time, but next time you're at, say, Fort Point or the Presidio Visitor Center, or even on Alcatraz, you can ask for a Anza Trail map, and they'll give it to you. Or you can even write to the Anza National Historic Trail. Their headquarters is over in the East Bay. You can write to them, ask for a brochure. It has a nice map of the trail and shows you where you can see all these different sites along the trail. And in the 200th anniversary of the trail, a bunch of reenactors walked much of the trail through the Sonoran Desert to San Diego and north. So they dressed as the explorers. They camped out like the explorers. And, you know, when you find a historical time period to portray, you'll find reenactors coming out of the woodwork because they love doing this stuff. And we have some wonderful pictures. If you go online and look for the anniversary of the Anza National Historic Trail, you'll see pictures of these folks in costume. So in 1775, Anza, now a lieutenant colonel, was put in charge of the soldiers and families recruited to colonize San Francisco. How do you colonize these people? Well, you tell them that where you're going is much better than where they are now. And some of these people didn't need convincing because they were living, in really poor conditions. So even though they're going to some place that's unknown, like immigrants today, they wanted to better their lives, and they were promised they would be given land in this new land, and that it was much better than where they are now. So he was able to get people to sign up for this journey. So they assembled around the mission at Tubac in present-day Arizona. The number of travelers was 240. 155 of them were women and children. The contingent also included 340 horses, 165 pack mules, and 302 cattle. 20 muleteers, 3 vaqueros, 3 Christian Indian interpreters, and 4 personal servants for the priests, including Sebastian Terabel, were included. It took them 2 hours just to load up all the animals before setting out on their journey on October 23 of that year. These paintings, by the way, were commissioned by Bill Singleton, an artist in Arizona, on the anniversary of this trail. And he did such a marvelous job, and he was very kind in allowing me to use these illustrations for tonight's talk. Now, before leaving, Anza addressed the entire company and said that when they encountered Native people, they were to be treated with kindness and not to be molested in any way. If horses were stolen, they were to be retrieved without harming the Indians. Force was to be used only in self-defense. He was one of the few enlightened Spanish officers who showed respect for Native people. Shortly after leaving the mission at Tupac, Maria Punuelas gave birth to a child, but she died due to complications of childbirth. The baby was one of 8 born along the way, and Maria was the only death along the 1,000-mile journey. So there you can see the baby boy born, and they're preparing the funeral over on the right side, or the burial. Imagine that, only one death out of that long journey. The Sonoran Desert is one of the hottest, driest areas of northern Mexico in the southwest United States. The average daytime temperature is 70 degrees in January, with the nighttime temperature down to about 40 degrees. Water is scarce, but you can find it if you know where to look. The big concern was finding water not only for the people, but for the hundreds of animals that followed behind them. In their previous journey through the desert, Sebastian Terabel had shown Anza where to look for water in this desert. Now, with so many people and animals, Anza split the expedition into 3 groups and paced them a day apart so the water sources could have time to refill. Men would dig down to where the water was, remove the dirt, and then fill jugs to redistribute to the people and the animals. This was a tedious but necessary task. The trek across the desert in Arizona was difficult, but thanks to the Coco-Maricopa tribe, additional water sources were shown to them, and guides showed them the way west. Padre Font was the diarist of the expedition, and he didn't have a lot of good things to say about Anza. He criticized him for not letting the priests use the astrolabe to calculate latitude much of the time, and he didn't like how Anza would break out the brandy for everyone during the occasional fandango. Anza wanted to bring up everybody's spirits, but Font thought this was the work of the devil. Not a real pleasant person to have around on your travels. When they arrived at the Colorado River, Anza was welcomed by Chief Palma of the Quechan band of Yuma people. Anza had met them on its exploratory trek the year before, and the village of 200 people came to see these visitors from another land. The Yuma invited all the members of the expedition to eat, giving them in abundance beans, squash, maize, wheat, and many watermelons. And you can imagine how much they enjoyed those watermelons after that long trek. This is one of the few tribes that was in California that were farmers. And because they were right close to the Colorado River, they always had water. And they became an agricultural people early on, and they had plenty of food that they could share. The Colorado River crossing at that time was 240 feet across and 6 feet deep, with a substantial flow of water. None of the immigrants knew how to swim, but thanks to the members of the Yuma tribe who guided them safely across, no one was lost in the crossing. There was a father and his son who fell off the horse, and the Yuma people swam over and retrieved them and brought them safely to shore. And they also guided the Father Font, who didn't want to cross at first. He was afraid of going across the water, but they guided him along, and he made it across. Anza made sure the expedition would avoid the huge algodones sand dunes along what is now the California-Mexican border, and skirted south before again heading northwest in today's Riverside County. These dunes are huge. They can be 100 to 200 feet high, and he knew that these animals would never make it over the dunes, so that's why that exploratory trip he took was really good, because he learned to avoid them altogether. As they came into the large San Jacinto Valley, their spirits were heartened by the wildflowers blooming from a recent rainfall. And you probably heard that this year the poppy fields were tremendous this year because of all the rain. So there are places in Southern California around Santa Barbara where you can just see acres and acres of California poppies. I'm not sure they're still there, but they might be. But as a winter storm blew in, the people encountered something they'd never seen before: snow. That night, the colonists and animals huddled for warmth, trying to outlast the storm. When Anza heard women crying, he asked them what was wrong. They said, "You are bringing us to a fearful place and we're going to die." He reassured them that it did not snow in San Francisco. He didn't tell them about the fog, however. Within 2 days, the weather improved and they resumed their journey. On January 4th, after trekking through the San Gabriel Valley, the immigrants arrived at Mission San Gabriel, which had been founded in 1771. Here they received a warm welcome by the Padres and a chance to rest for 2 months at this halfway point in their journey. Actually, the reason they were there for so long is that they got news about an Indian uprising at the San Diego mission, so Portolá and some of his soldiers had to make that trek all the way down to San Diego to restore order and then come all the way back. So that accounts for the 2-month delay here, but I'm sure the people didn't mind relaxing for 2 months. The expedition continued on its way in February, arriving at Mission San Antonio de Padua in early March. At that time, there were 2 priests, a small adobe church, priest quarters, and several workshops. I don't know if the Padres knew there would be 200 people staying for dinner, but they had to make do. And by the way, this present church shown here wasn't completed until 1813. Now, I have to tell you a story. I sometimes go to these mission days. Every mission has them, and they celebrate the story of the mission, and they have reenactors come. Sometimes they'll have Mexican soldados coming on their horses with the leather jackets. They'll have mountain men with their skins, animal skins and tents and weapons. And then you have the wonderful California dancers and musicians. So I went to this mission for their mission days. I came as a Yankee trader. Well, I was going to come as a Padre, but they said, no, we have a Padre. because I have of course, I have something for every event. So I had a gray Franciscan robe, which is what they wore in those days. So I said, I'll be a padre. No, we have a padre. So I went down there, and the padre was wearing a brown robe and tennis shoes. And I said to the organizer, your padre isn't dressed right. And she said, oh, well, that's because he's the padre of the mission today. So okay, we'll give him some latitude there. But anyway, I came as a Yankee trader, and I'm a calligrapher, so I was writing kids' names with a goose quill, which fascinated them. But after everybody was gone, the reenactors could stay in the garden. And it was at that wonderful moment in time when the sun had set, that golden hue that's over the garden. So we were there, just the reenactors. The musicians were playing their music. And all of a sudden, it happened. I was in 1830, California. That's what every reenactor wants, is that magic moment you've gone back in time, because it was just us. We're all Californios at that time. It was magical. And you should, anytime that there's a mission event, I would recommend you try to see at least one, because they're quite fun. Let's see, I lost my place here. When the expedition arrived at Monterey, Lieutenant Colonel Anza, Sergeant Moraga, and Padre Font, and a few soldiers rode ahead to find a suitable place to build a Presidio at San Francisco Bay. Anza thought the bluff overlooking the strait would be a good location for placing cannons, and a nearby level plain with a view of the bay would be ideal for a fort, which is, of course, where the Presidio is today. They returned to Monterey, and Moraga was commissioned to gather the colonists and lead them to their new home, while Anza returned to Mexico. The soldiers and settlers right away began to build shelters, rather crude ones at first, due to a lack of timber. It took many, many months to bring timber from elsewhere and to make the adobe bricks to build a chapel and quarters for the officers and soldiers. The walls varied in height and originally only had 3 sides. In the meantime, Padre Font found a location for the mission deliberately at a distance from the soldiers at the Presidio. Over time and by various means, the Padres were able to entice the local Ohlone tribes to visit them and stay at the mission to help build the church. Father Serra said Mass while the church was being built, and his friend, Father Palu, became the head priest. Out of the 21 missions, this is the only one that has remained intact since it was built, even after the 1906 earthquake. It's the only mission that has a California native as a curator. So the reason it withstood the earthquake is it's really solidly built. Those walls are 6 feet thick, and the timbers are redwood. And when you go inside it, I presume you've all visited the mission, but if you haven't, when you go up and see the timbers, that's the original painting design done by the native people on the timbers. And it's a remarkable mission. And the curator is Andrew Galvan, whose ancestor was one of the Ohlone chiefs who was baptized by the Padres. And his family has continually remained Catholic all this time. And he has turned the narrative, unlike a lot of the other missions where the narrative is about the Spanish, the narrative there is about the Indians, because they were the ones, I should say the Ohlone, they were the ones who built the mission. They're the ones who lived at the mission and maintained the mission. So if you haven't visited lately, you should go visit. And if he's ever giving a tour, by all means, take his tour. He also is an anthropologist, so he has both sides of the equation in interpreting the mission there. As time went on, more laborers were needed to continue building the Presidio mission. Louis Joris, a Russian artist, visited Presidio and made the sketch in 1813. It shows the soldiers bringing native men to the Presidio, no doubt to work there. By this time, almost all the local native population had been forced into the missions, either by being rounded up or because of starvation. The cattle and pigs were eating the seeds and acorns that they relied on for food. Within 2 decades, 75% of the native people had died from diseases brought by the Spanish from starvation. The biggest killers were measles and the smallpox. So for a long time, I taught about the California missions, and for a long time in elementary school, we talked about all the benefits of the Spanish missions. But now with this reckoning that's going on now about the full story of the missions, we have to include, we have to lean into being uncomfortable with history. And so to tell the real story of the missions, you have to talk about what the missions did to the culture and the people. Of course, the Spanish didn't intend to kill the Indians, but they brought all these diseases to which the Indians had no immunity. They were dying from the flu, from colds, again, because they had no immunity. And because they had been put in these barracks, diseases spread very quickly. So under the streets, all around the San Francisco mission, under the streets, under the houses, are the bones of hundreds of Ohlone people. And finally, we're recognizing, of course, what the effects of colonization does to a people. But I do want to say that there were native people who resisted. The Ohlone in the East Bay, they were attacking these patrols going out to round up Indians, so they attacked those patrols. The Yokuts didn't allow Spanish into their territory. Even the Pomos resisted. So there was resistance, but what happened was that the disease weakened them. They reduced the numbers. They also depressed them because they're losing all their family, their relatives. So it was a depressing time for them. So the effect of colonization was devastating to the native people. There are pockets of Ohlone left, and like I said, the ones over in the East Bay, the ones in the South Bay, and they are coming to terms also with this whole history and trying to revive their culture, their language, their religion. So they are teaching their children their ancient language, which is great. And I always tell my students that we have much to learn from the native people because they knew how to live in harmony with nature for hundreds of years, something we sort of lost in today's world. We have to get back to that because of what we're doing to the environment, and they could teach us. And one of the ways they can teach us is how to do controlled burns. So they do have, for example, a Miwok Indian in Caltran, Cal Fire, has hired him to help them do a controlled burning in Marin County and Sonoma County. So that's just one small way that they can teach us how to live more in harmony with nature. On the lee side of the peninsula, the little village of Yerba Buena began to grow around a cove where an occasional ship would anchor. One of the residents was a sailor on a British whaling ship, William Richardson, who while on leave went to a fandango at the Presidio and danced with a pretty Spanish lady. He never went back to the ship. Well, who can blame him? And in 1825, he married that lady, Maria Martinez, the daughter of the Comandante. He laid out a street plan for the pueblo of Yerba Buena around the plaza and built the first 2-story house in the village. He also founded the town of Sausalito. So he's the one that laid down the Calle de Fundación, which is the main street in Yerba Buena, which we now call Grant Avenue. But that was, and you can't really call it a street, it was more like a dirt road, but that was the beginning. The Hudson Bay Company was a British institution in North America with many trading posts in British North America, as depicted in this trading post in the Northwest. They exchanged manufactured goods and foodstuffs in exchange for furs, and a trading post was established in Yerba Buena in 1841 by James Douglas. That post, by the way, was located right across the street from us. There's a plaque across the street about the Hudson Bay Company store. He sold lumber, tinware, blankets, and other commodities in exchange for hide and tallow and otter pelts. But within a year, the chief administrator of the Hudson Bay Company in Vancouver decided to close the California outpost. Richardson, Douglas, as well as John Sutter, Robert Livermore, reflect the growing number of outsiders coming into California, eventually diminishing the Spanish and Mexican government's control over California. Who would have known that in time that little village of Yerba Buena would eventually become the world-class city of San Francisco, which carries on the Spanish tradition of hospitality and celebration. I say that because I'm a guide over in Alcatraz, so I meet people from all over the world all the time, and I always ask them, how do you find San Francisco? Are the people friendly? And they always say yes. And that's a real testament to this. That's why I say it's part of the Spanish tradition of welcoming people. And so that's a good thing to say about a city, I think. Yes, colonization caused great destruction to the Ohlone people, but they are still here. They still celebrate their culture. They are reviving their language, and they share their wisdom of living in harmony with nature if we just listen to them. So these are the Rumsen Ohlone that come up for the, they used to come up for the celebration, the birthday celebration held every year at the Presidio. And the descendants of the Anza expedition are still here too. The Alvisos, the Bernals, the Berriesas, the Castros, the Gallegos, the Peraltas are all familiar names, and their descendants still live in the Bay Area. Many belong to Los Californios, an organization that celebrates the birthday of San Francisco, which happened in June of 1776. A pivotal year, right? So on the East Coast, the American Empire is beginning, and the Spanish Empire is reaching its zenith at the same year. This year, the celebration takes place starting at 10 a.m. on Saturday, June 29th at the Presidio. So if you want to go there, there will be people in costume, and they will have speeches, and they'll be laying of wreaths and so on. The Ohlone people might come, I'm not sure. But this is, again, Saturday, the last Saturday in June at 10 a.m. at the Presidio. So in conclusion, the next time you have a California wine along with an enchilada, you can thank the Spanish and Mexican immigrants who introduced these to California. So I say, comamos, let's eat. Thank you.